After my son's funeral, my daughter-in-law Claire leaned close to my ear, her voice shaking, and whispered, "You need to go to my office immediately. Go alone. You could be in danger." And my throat went dry. I just nodded, watching her walk away quickly, her hands trembling, and I realized that whatever killed my son 2 weeks ago, it wasn't what the doctors had told us. The funeral was small, grey clouds covering the cemetery like the grief covering my chest. William was 42 years old, a successful lawyer, and they said his heart just stopped while he slept. But Claire's warning, the fear in her eyes, the way she'd avoided everyone all morning, something wasn't right. I watched her get into her car and drive away, and I knew I had to follow her instructions. 20 minutes later, I pulled up to her office. A small building on the edge of town. The door was unlocked, lights off inside. My heart was pounding as I pushed it open and called her name. No answer. I stepped inside slowly, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. That's when I saw him, a man sitting in Claire's chair, his back to me, perfectly still. The office was silent except for my breathing. He turned slowly, and when I saw his face, when I recognized who it was, my blood turned to ice. This man, sitting here in the dark, waiting for me, was supposed to be dead. William had told me himself 6 months ago that this man had died in a car accident overseas, but he was very much alive, and the smile on his face told me that everything I thought I knew about my son's death, about my family, about the last 6 months, was a lie, and whatever he was about to tell me was going to shatter my world completely. But before we get to that office, before I tell you who was sitting in that chair waiting for me, you need to understand who I am and how I missed every single warning sign that my son was in danger. My name is Oliver James Harrison. I'm 68 years old, and I spent the last 43 years of my life as a high school English teacher in Phoenix, Arizona. I taught Shakespeare and Hemingway to teenagers who mostly didn't care. I graded papers every night at my kitchen table, and I lived what most people would call an ordinary, quiet life in a modest 3-bedroom house that my wife Margaret and I bought in 1985 was just 2 years old. Margaret died 5 years ago from breast cancer. It took her in 8 months, and after she passed, I kept teaching because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Didn't know how to exist in a house that still smelled like her perfume, but no longer had her laughter filling the rooms. William was my only child. We'd wanted more kids, but it never happened. So I poured everything into him, watched him grow from a curious little boy into a brilliant man who graduated top of his law school class and built a career I was incredibly proud of. He married Claire 7 years ago. They had Emma 3 years after that, and every Sunday they'd come over for dinner, and William would tell me about his cases, and I'd pretend to understand legal jargon I had no training for. But I loved listening because it meant my son trusted me enough to share his world. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that I'm not a detective. I'm not former FBI or ex-military. I'm just a retired English teacher who reads mystery novels and watches crime shows and thought I understood human nature because I'd spent decades analyzing characters in books. But books don't prepare you for real evil, for the kind of people who smile at your son's funeral while knowing they're the reason he's dead. And when William started showing signs that something was wrong in the weeks before he died, I missed every single one because I was too busy being a normal father who assumed his son's stress was just work pressure, not a warning that someone was planning to kill him. 3 weeks before William died, he called me at 11:30 at night, voice tight and strained, saying, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet tomorrow for lunch?" I said yes, and we set it up for Mario's Italian restaurant where we always went, but the next morning he cancelled, said something came up at the office, and I didn't push because William was always busy with big cases and important clients. 2 weeks before he died, Claire called me. That should have been my first warning because Claire never called me directly. She said, "Oliver just wanted to let you know William's been really stressed with work. Give him some space." And her voice sounded wrong, like she was reading from a script. but I just said, "Okay, honey. Tell him I'm here if he needs me." 1 week before William died, he showed up at my house without calling, stood in my living room staring at family photos with dark circles under his eyes and wrinkled clothes, and he said, "Dad, if something happens to me." But his phone rang, and his whole face changed from tired to terrified, and he said, "Yes, I understand," and hung up and told me he had to leave immediately. Promised he'd come back tomorrow to finish our conversation. I watched him run to his car, watched him check his mirrors 3 times like someone was following him, and I thought I should stop him, should demand to know what was happening. But I didn't, because teachers don't think like that. Teachers think their students are overreacting about exams, and their sons are overreacting about work deadlines. 3 days later, Claire called at 6 in the morning crying that William didn't wake up, that the paramedics couldn't save him, that sudden cardiac arrest had taken my 42-year-old marathon-running son in his sleep, and now lying in bed replaying every conversation I'd missed, I knew with absolute certainty that William had been trying to warn me, that someone had killed him, and that whoever was waiting in Claire's office was about to tell me exactly who and why, and God help me, I was going to make sure they paid for taking my son away from me. The drive to Claire's office took 20 minutes, but felt like hours. My hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white, my mind racing through every possibility of who could be waiting for me and why Claire had looked so terrified at the funeral. Her office was in a small commercial building on the east side of town, the kind of place where interior designers and accountants rent cheap space. And when I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed only 2 other cars. One of them was Claire's blue sedan, and the other was a black Mercedes I didn't recognize. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I pushed the door open wider, said, "Claire, are you here?" And the person in the chair slowly turned around, and when I saw his face, I actually stumbled backward and hit the doorframe, because this man sitting calmly in my daughter-in-law's office was supposed to be dead for the last 6 months. His name was Mark Chen. He'd been William's business partner before William joined the law firm. They'd started a small legal consulting company together right out of law school, but it fell apart after 3 years, and they'd had a massive falling out over money and clients. William told me Mark had moved overseas, said he'd heard through mutual friends that Mark died in a car accident in Singapore. There was even a small memorial service that William attended. I remembered because William came to my house afterward, looking shaken and guilty about how their friendship had ended. But here was Mark Chen very much alive, wearing an expensive suit, his expression completely calm, like we'd planned this meeting. And when he spoke, his voice was steady and controlled in a way that made my skin crawl. Mark said, "Sit down, Oliver. We need to talk about your son," and I just stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to understand how a dead man was sitting in front of me talking about William. He pointed to the chair across from Claire's desk and said, "Please, I know this is shocking, but I promise everything will make sense." And against every instinct telling me to run, I walked over and sat down, my legs shaking, and Mark leaned forward and said, "The first thing you need to know is that William didn't die of a heart attack. Someone killed him," and I felt all the air leave my lungs. Before I could speak, he pulled out a manila envelope from inside his jacket, thick and heavy, and slid it across the desk toward me. Said, "Your son spent the last 6 months of his life documenting one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in Arizona history. He had evidence that could destroy some very powerful people, and 3 days before he was supposed to turn everything over to the authorities, he died suddenly in his sleep. You really think that's a coincidence?" I opened the envelope with trembling hands, and inside were photographs, bank statements, printed emails, and a USB drive. Mark said William knew he was in danger. That's why he came to me. We faked my death so I could help him investigate without anyone knowing, and I was staring at a photo of William meeting with someone in a parking garage when I heard footsteps behind me and spun around to see Claire standing in the doorway, her face pale and streaked with tears. She looked at Mark and then at me and said, "I'm sorry, Oliver. I wanted to tell you at the funeral, but there were too many people watching, too many people from William's firm who can't know what we're doing. And Mark said the firm your son worked for isn't just a law office, it's a front for money laundering and human trafficking. And the senior partner, James Whitmore, is at the center of everything. And William found proof. Hours and hours of recorded conversations, financial transactions, everything needed to bring them down. But someone found out what he was doing and they killed him for it, made it look natural, paid off the medical examiner to sign off on cardiac arrest. And Oliver, they know that William had a backup plan. They know he made copies of everything and they're looking for those copies right now. Which means you and Claire and your granddaughter Emma are all in danger until we finish what William started. Mark locked the office door behind Claire and pulled the blinds closed, said we can't be too careful, they have people watching, and my hands were still shaking as I held that USB drive, this tiny piece of plastic that apparently contained evidence worth killing for. Claire moved behind her desk and opened her laptop. Mark plugged in the drive, and when the files loaded, I saw hundreds of folders organized by date. Each one labeled with names I didn't recognize, and transaction amounts that made my head spin. Millions of dollars moving through accounts that had nothing to do with legal work. Mark clicked on the first folder, dated 8 months ago, and said this is when William first noticed irregularities in one of his cases, a real estate deal for a client named Richard Castellanos. Seemed legitimate on the surface, but William saw patterns in the paperwork that didn't make sense. Shell companies buying properties with cash, ownership transferring between entities that didn't exist, and once he started digging, he realized his firm wasn't just representing criminals, they were actively helping them launder money. The folders showed months of William's work, bank statements he'd secretly copied, emails between senior partner James Whitmore and Castellanos discussing how to move funds without triggering federal reporting requirements, photographs William had taken of meetings in parking garages and empty warehouses, audio recordings of phone calls where Whitmore casually discussed falsifying documents and bribing officials. Claire was crying silently as Mark scrolled through file after file, and I kept thinking about my son, my English teacher brain trying to comprehend that the boy I'd raised had become some kind of undercover investigator, risking his life to expose corruption I didn't even know existed. Then Mark opened a video file dated 4 days before William died, and suddenly my son's face filled the screen. He looked exhausted and scared, sitting in what I recognized as his home office late at night. And when he started talking, his voice cracked with emotion. "Dad, if you're watching this, then something happened to me. I need you to know. I didn't want to put you in danger, but I couldn't let this continue. Whitmore and Castellanos aren't just moving money, they're trafficking people. I have evidence of young women being brought into the country illegally and sold. I documented everything, every transaction, every name, every location. And I was supposed to meet with the FBI tomorrow, but Whitmore confronted me today, said I should think carefully about my family's safety before I do anything stupid." William's image on that screen looked directly at the camera, directly at me, and said, "I'm scared, Dad, but I have to do this. If something happens, please make sure this evidence gets to the right people. Please don't let them win." And the video ended with my son wiping tears from his eyes, and I sat there staring at the blank screen, feeling rage build in my chest like nothing I'd ever felt before. Mark's voice cut through my thoughts. Said Oliver, "There's something else you need to know. William discovered that someone close to you, someone in your own family, has been working with Whitmore for years, and that person knew what William was investigating." And I felt my blood turn to ice as Mark pulled up another file. This one marked with a name that made my whole world collapse. David Harrison, Oliver's brother. And suddenly I understood why Claire had been so terrified, why she'd warned me I could be in danger, because the conspiracy that killed my son wasn't just about strangers and criminals. It was about family betrayal at the deepest possible level. And my own brother had helped murder William. I stared at my brother's name on that screen and felt something break inside my chest. David was 5 years younger than me. We'd grown up in the same house, shared the same parents, and yes, we'd had our problems over the years, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. This was betrayal at a level that made my hands shake with rage. Mark clicked on an audio file, and suddenly David's voice filled the office. I'd know that voice anywhere. Heard it at family dinners and holiday gatherings for 63 years. And now I was hearing it say, Michael is getting too close to the Castellanos operation. You need to handle this before he destroys everything we've built. Whitmore's voice responded, asking, are you sure about this, David? He's your nephew. And my brother laughed, actually laughed, and said, family doesn't pay my bills, James. I didn't work this hard, building connections just to watch some self-righteous kid with a law degree tear it all down. Mark played file after file, a timeline of David's involvement going back 3 years. Turned out my brother had been the one who introduced Castellanos to Whitmore in the first place. David worked as a, quote, consultant, unquote, which really meant he connected wealthy criminals with corrupt lawyers and took a commission on every deal. I'd always known David struggled with money. Knew he'd failed at multiple businesses and filed bankruptcy twice, but I thought he'd finally gotten his life together. Thought the expensive car and nice clothes meant he'd found legitimate success. The audio files told a different story. Showed David getting paid $50,000 here, $75,000 there, showed him becoming dependent on dirty money, and then showed what happened when William started investigating. David's voice getting more desperate in each recording, saying my nephew won't listen to reason, saying Michael is going to expose everything, saying we need a permanent solution. And in a file dated 2 days before William died, I heard David say, it's done, you have my guarantee, the problem will be handled by this weekend. Claire's voice cut through my shock. She said, David threatened us, Oliver. He came to our house 3 weeks before William died. Told us that if William didn't stop investigating, then something bad might happen to Emma. Said accidents happen to little girls all the time. And I watched my daughter-in-law break down crying as she described how my own brother had threatened my 5-year-old granddaughter's life to protect his criminal empire. Mark leaned forward and said, Oliver, I know this is devastating, but we need you to focus. David isn't the only family member involved. He had help from someone even closer to William, someone inside your family who had daily access to your son, someone who could put that toxin in his morning coffee without raising suspicion. And I looked at Mark thinking, there's no one closer than Claire. And he must have seen the horror on my face because he quickly said, not Claire. She's been helping us from the beginning, but there's someone else, someone William trusted completely. Someone who was in the house the morning he died. And when Mark pulled up the next file showing security camera footage from William's front door, when I saw who walked into that house at 6:15 a.m. carrying a coffee cup, I felt my entire world shatter because it was someone I'd trusted my whole life, someone who'd been at the funeral crying fake tears. And suddenly every family gathering, every holiday dinner, every moment of trust over the years felt like poison in my veins. Mark shut the laptop and looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. Said Oliver, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to move fast. David and Whitmore are planning something. We intercepted communications that suggest they're going to eliminate all remaining evidence this weekend, which means Claire and Emma are targets. Which means we need to act now before anyone else gets hurt. He pulled out his phone and made a call, said it's time, bring her in. And 2 minutes later there was a knock on the office door. Mark opened it and a woman in a dark suit walked in holding a badge. FBI Special Agent Lisa Morrison. She said, I've been working with Mark and William for the past 4 months, building a case against Castellanos and Whitmore. And Oliver, I'm sorry for your loss. Your son was one of the bravest men I've ever worked with. He knew the risks, and he did it anyway because he couldn't live with himself knowing what these people were doing. Agent Morrison sat down and explained that they had everything they needed to arrest Whitmore and Castellanos. Bank records, audio files, video evidence. But they needed one more piece to make the case airtight. They needed David's confession on tape. needed him to admit his role in William's death, and the only way to get that was for someone he trusted to wear a wire and get him talking. I felt my stomach drop as I realized what she was asking. You want me to confront my brother? You want me to get him to confess that he killed my son? And Morrison nodded, said, I know it's asking the impossible, but David won't talk to law enforcement. He'll lawyer up immediately. But if you go to his house, tell him you're confused about William's death. Tell him you need family support. He might let his guard down, might say something incriminating, especially if he thinks you're just a grieving father who doesn't suspect anything. Claire grabbed my hand and said, Oliver, you don't have to do this. It's too dangerous. What if David realizes you're wearing a wire? What if he gets violent? But I looked at William's face still frozen on that laptop screen, looked at my son who'd spent 6 months risking his life to expose these criminals, and I knew I didn't have a choice. I had to finish what he started, had to make sure his death meant something. I told Morrison I'd do it, asked when, and she said tomorrow, Saturday, David is meeting with Whitmore at his estate in the afternoon. We want you to go to David's house in the morning, before that meeting, catch him off guard. And Mark added that they'd have agents positioned around the property. Said if I felt threatened at any point, I just needed to say a code word and they'd be inside in 60 seconds. But the goal was to let David talk, let him feel comfortable, let him think his older brother was too naive to see the truth. Morrison handed me a small device no bigger than a button, said this is the wire. We'll attach it to your shirt tomorrow morning. It's voice-activated and has a range of half a mile. Just have a normal conversation. Let David lead. And if you can get him to talk about William, about the money, about Whitmore, we'll have everything we need to put him away for life. And Oliver, I promise you, by tomorrow night your brother will be in custody, and justice will be served for your son. Saturday morning arrived grey and cold. I woke up at 5 a.m. after maybe 2 hours of broken sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David's face. Saw him as a little boy running after me wanting to play catch. Saw him as a teenager borrowing money he never paid back. Saw him as a man who apparently valued cash more than his own nephew's life. Agent Morrison arrived at my house at 6:30 with the wire a tiny microphone no bigger than a shirt button. She attached it to the inside of my collar while explaining for the 3rd time that backup was ready, that agents would be positioned in unmarked cars within 2 blocks of David's house, that the moment I said the code word, Margaret, my late wife's name, they'd storm in within 60 seconds. But Oliver, she said, looking me straight in the eye, we need his confession. We need him to say what he did. So unless you're in immediate physical danger, you have to let him talk. Let him brag. Men like your brother always want someone to know how clever they think they are. The drive to David's house took 15 minutes. He lived in an expensive neighborhood in North Scottsdale. The kind of place where houses have gates and 3-car garages and landscaping that costs more than my annual teacher's pension. I'd always wondered how David afforded it on his consultant salary, but now I knew. Blood money, dirty money, money earned by helping criminals destroy lives. I pulled up to his gate and pressed the intercom button, my hand shaking slightly, and David's voice came through the speaker, sounding cheerful and warm. Robert, what a surprise, brother. Come on in. And as the gate slowly opened, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Whitmore's black Mercedes was parked in the driveway next to David's silver Lexus, which meant I wasn't just walking into a conversation with my brother. I was walking into a meeting with both men who'd orchestrated my son's murder. I almost turned around, almost called it off. But then I thought about William's face on that video saying, Dad, please don't let them win. And I forced myself to park, to get out of the car, to walk up those stone steps to the front door that opened before I could knock. David stood there wearing expensive casual clothes, golf shirt and khakis, his smile wide and fake, threw his arms around me in a hug that made my skin crawl. Said, come in, I was just having coffee with James. You remember James Whitmore from William's firm? Terrible tragedy about your son. We were just talking about him, actually. I walked into a living room that looked like something from an interior design magazine, leather furniture and abstract art, and windows overlooking a pool. And there was Whitmore, sitting on the couch with his coffee cup, standing up to shake my hand, his grip firm and his eyes cold. "Oliver, so sorry for your loss. William was an exceptional attorney. We're all devastated at the firm." I sat down in the chair they offered, accepted the coffee David poured, even though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the cup. And I said, "I'm sorry to intrude. I know you're busy." But I couldn't sleep last night. Kept thinking about William, about how sudden it was, and I needed to talk to family, needed to understand how this could happen to a healthy 42-year-old man. David and Whitmore exchanged a quick glance. Barely a second, but I caught it, and David sat down next to Whitmore. Said, "These things happen. Oliver." The doctors explained it was a cardiac event. Sometimes there's underlying conditions nobody knows about. And I nodded slowly, said, I know. But Claire mentioned something yesterday that confused me, said William had been stressed about work, said he was worried about something. Do you know what that was about? The room went quiet for maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt like an hour, and I watched David's face carefully, watched him decide how to play this. And finally, Whitmore spoke, his voice smooth and practiced. William was working on some complex cases, high-pressure situations. You know how it is in corporate law. Probably just normal work stress. Nothing to worry about now. But I pressed, said Claire, said William mentioned your name, David, said he needed to talk to you about something important, and that's when I saw it. That flash in my brother's eyes, that mixture of anger and fear and arrogance, and he leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and said, Oliver, why are you really here? Why are you asking these questions? And I felt my heart pounding against my ribs, knowing I was on the edge of something dangerous, knowing that the next words out of my mouth would either get me the confession we needed or get me killed in my brother's living room. And I looked at David, at the man who used to be my family, and I said, because I know William was investigating something. I know he found evidence of crimes, and I need to know if his death had anything to do with it. And the silence that followed was so thick I could barely breathe. And then David smiled, a cold, cruel smile I'd never seen before, and said, Oliver, you have no idea what you're getting into. You should leave, now, while you still can. David's words hung in the air like a threat. You should leave now while you still can, and I felt every muscle in my body tense, knowing I was either about to get the confession we needed or about to die in this room. But I couldn't back down now, not after everything William had sacrificed. So I looked my brother straight in the eye and said, I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth. Did you have something to do with my son's death? Whitmore stood up slowly, his hand moving toward his jacket pocket, and said, Oliver, you're making a very dangerous mistake. You need to stop asking questions about things you don't understand. William was meddling in affairs that were none of his business, and sometimes people who meddle face consequences, and that's when I saw it. The gun in Whitmore's hand, small and black, and pointed directly at my chest. David jumped up and said, Wait, James, what are you doing? And Whitmore said, Shut up, David. Your brother isn't here for a friendly visit. He's fishing for information, which means someone told him something. So, Oliver, who have you been talking to? Who told you to come here? And I felt my throat go dry, felt my heart hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. And Whitmore walked closer, said, Take off your shirt, slowly, and I knew he suspected the wire, knew that in about 10 seconds he was going to find it, and then both David and Whitmore would know I'd been working with the FBI. I stood up slowly, my hands shaking, and started unbuttoning my shirt, and Whitmore said, That's good, keep going. And when he saw the small microphone attached to my collar, his face went white with rage. He ripped it off and threw it across the room. Said, You bastard, you've been recording us. Who sent you? Was it Mark Chen? And I didn't answer because I was calculating how far I was from the door, wondering if I could run, wondering if I should just say Margaret right now and pray the FBI could get here before Whitmore pulled that trigger. David was staring at the wire on the floor, his face a mixture of shock and betrayal. And he said, "Oliver, you're working with the police. How could you do this to me? I'm your brother." And something inside me snapped. All the fear turned into pure rage. And I said, "How could I? How could I? You killed my son David. You helped murder William, your own nephew, for money. And don't you dare talk to me about family when you sold out yours for a paycheck." David's face crumbled and he started shaking his head, said, No, I didn't kill him. It was Whitmore's idea. William was going to destroy everything, all the money, all the connections, years of work. And Whitmore said he knew someone who could make it look natural. And I just didn't stop it. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. And Oliver, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And watching my brother break down, watching him admit what he'd done, I felt something cold settle in my chest, because this wasn't the little boy I'd protected from bullies. This was a stranger wearing my brother's face, a stranger who'd chosen greed over blood. Whitmore pointed the gun at David now, said, "You weak, pathetic fool, shut your mouth before you confess to everything." But David couldn't stop, the words pouring out like he'd been holding them in for months. It was supposed to be quick. A toxin in his morning coffee, something that would cause cardiac arrest, untraceable in a normal autopsy. We paid the medical examiner $20,000 to sign off without digging deeper, and William never knew what hit him. He just went to sleep and didn't wake up, and I was standing there listening to my brother describe my son's murder in clinical detail, describe how they'd poisoned William's coffee, and I wanted to scream, wanted to lunge at David and Whitmore both. But before I could move, I heard the most beautiful sound of my life. Sirens, multiple sirens getting closer, and Whitmore's eyes went wide as he realized what was happening. He turned the gun back toward me and said, "You said the code word. When did you say it?" And I smiled, actually smiled at him, and said I didn't have to. The wire transmits constantly. The FBI has been listening to every word you both said for the last 10 minutes. And they heard David confess to conspiracy to commit murder. And James, they heard you admit to arranging William's death. And you're both going to prison for the rest of your lives. The front door exploded inward, FBI agents flooding into the room shouting, "Hands up, drop the weapon," and Whitmore tried to aim at me one last time, but 3 agents tackled him before he could fire, knocked the gun from his hand and forced him to the ground, and David just stood there with his hands in the air, tears streaming down his face, saying, I'm sorry, over and over like it meant anything, like sorry could bring back my son, like sorry could undo what he'd done. Agent Morrison walked in and said, "Oliver Harrison, you did it. We have everything on tape, full confession from both of them." And I walked over to David, who was being handcuffed by 2 agents, looked at my brother one last time, and said, "I hope it was worth it, David. I hope that blood money bought you everything you wanted, because it cost you your soul, and it cost William his life, and I never want to see your face again. You're not my brother anymore. You're just another criminal who got what he deserved." And as they dragged David out, he looked back at me one last time, his face broken with regret. But I felt nothing, no pity, no sadness, just the cold satisfaction of knowing that justice had finally been served. They took me to FBI headquarters that afternoon, and I spent 6 hours giving my statement, walking them through every detail from the funeral to the confrontation. And Agent Morrison told me that David and Whitmore were being held without bail, that both of them were already trying to cut deals, but the evidence was too strong, the recorded confession too clear. They were looking at life sentences for conspiracy to commit murder and racketeering. The investigation expanded over the next 48 hours. Turns out William's documentation had exposed a network of corruption that reached into judges, offices and police departments and corporate boardrooms across 3 states. 23 people were arrested in coordinated raids, and suddenly the story was everywhere. National news covering the fallen attorney who died exposing a massive criminal conspiracy. And my phone wouldn't stop ringing with reporters wanting interviews, wanting to know how it felt to turn in my own brother, wanting me to perform my grief for their cameras. Claire and Emma had been in protective custody during the confrontation. FBI kept them at a safe house until all the arrests were made. And when they finally brought them back to my house 3 days after David's arrest, when Emma ran into my arms asking where Mommy had taken her and why they couldn't go home yet, I broke down crying for the first time since William's funeral, couldn't hold it together anymore. Claire held both of us, the three of us standing in my living room, clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. And she whispered, "Thank you, Oliver. Thank you for being brave enough to finish what William started." And I wanted to tell her I wasn't brave. I was terrified every second. Wanted to tell her that every night I lay awake, wondering if I could have saved William if I'd just paid more attention to the warning signs. But Emma was there asking why Grandpa was crying, so I just said I miss Daddy. And she said, "Me too, Grandpa, me too." The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings and therapy sessions, and trying to figure out how to explain family betrayal to a 5-year-old who wanted to know why Uncle David couldn't come to her birthday party. Claire and I agreed to tell Emma that Uncle David made very bad choices and had to go away for a long time. That sometimes people we love do things we can't forgive. And watching Emma process that information, watching her little face try to understand how adults can be so cruel, I realized that William's death had stolen more than just a father. It had stolen her innocence, her ability to trust family completely. 6 weeks after the arrests, I stood at William's grave again, this time alone in the early morning, and I told him everything, told him about David's confession and the convictions and the 23 victims whose cases were solved because of his investigation. Told him that Claire and Emma were safe now, that they were going to be okay eventually. And as I stood there talking to my son's headstone, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see a young woman, maybe 19 years old, standing there holding flowers. And she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Are you William Harrison's father?" And when I nodded, she said, "Your son saved my life. I was one of the girls they trafficked. And because of his evidence, I'm free now. And I wanted to thank him, wanted to thank you." And as I stood there watching this stranger place flowers on my son's grave, I realized that William's sacrifice had meant something bigger than our family, had meant freedom for people who had no voice. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start healing. 6 months later, life had found a new rhythm. Claire and Emma moved in with me temporarily while she rebuilt her life, and the house that had been so quiet after Margaret died was now filled with a 5-year-old's laughter and the sound of family again. Different family than before, but family nonetheless. David was sentenced to 25 years without parole. Whitmore got life plus 40, and every single person involved in the conspiracy faced justice. William's investigation had exposed corruption that reached higher than anyone imagined, and his name became synonymous with courage in legal circles. They even created a scholarship in his honor for law students who want to fight corporate crime. I learned something important through all of this. Family betrayal cuts deeper than any other kind of wound because it comes from people who are supposed to protect you, people you trusted with your whole heart. And David's choice to value money over blood, to help murder his own nephew for a paycheck, that taught me that family isn't just about shared DNA, it's about shared values. And sometimes the people who share your name are the ones who hurt you most. But I also learned that you can survive it. You can come out the other side and build something new from the ashes. Claire and Emma and I, we're building that now. We're healing together. And William's legacy isn't just the criminals he exposed. It's the family he left behind who refuses to let evil win. If you've experienced family secrets or family betrayal, if someone you loved chose greed or cruelty over loyalty, I want you to know you're not alone. Leave a comment below sharing your story because we heal together, we survive together, and your pain matters. And if this story moved you, if you want to hear more real stories about family revenge and how ordinary people find extraordinary courage, Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, because every week I share another journey, another truth, another reminder that justice is possible even when it feels impossible. Thank you for listening. Stay strong and never stop fighting for what's right.